I'm your host, Richard Hara, and I'm delighted to welcome to the program today three guests, three members of our faculty at the Columbia School of Social Work, Professor Qin Gao, who's also director of the China Center for Social Policy. I have Amy Kapadia, who is a lecturer in discipline and a former research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, as well as Jeanette Takamura, who is professor and dean emerita of the Columbia School of Social Work. So welcome to Social Impact Live. I'm going to start the program as usual, just inviting you to maybe share a little bit of your background, what brought you to social work, and what's been your primary area of interest, either as a researcher or as a clinician in social work. So Qin, is it all right if we start with you?
Of course. Thank you, Richard. And it's my honor to be on today's program with my colleagues. I'm Qin Gao. I come from China. When I was in high school, my dream was to pursue, pursue a career that is for social justice. So I wanted to become a judge or a lawyer, but fate had it. When I went to college, China was launching the social work profession, and they randomly picked some people and said, okay, you guys go to social work. And I was one of the lucky ones to pursue social justice through the profession of social work. I've never looked back and regretted. I think I found my calling in social work. Currently, my research focuses on two areas. One is poverty, inequality, and the social policies, mainly in China, but also from comparative perspectives. The other is actually the focus of our conversation today, which is Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans in New York City, how they are using all different kinds of resources to meet their needs. And in this pandemic, how the racial discrimination and other kinds of demands are impacting their lives.
All right. Thank you, Qin, for that self-introduction and a reminder of what we're actually here to talk about, which I neglected to mention as part of the opening. But I'll have more to say about that in just a moment. Let me turn to Amy now. Amy, want to introduce yourself and your interests?
Sure. So sort of similarly, but not as dramatically as Dr. Gao, I sort of fell into social work as well. And I began working in the community mental health organization, basically so I could leave my parents' home after graduating from college. And the added benefit was falling in love with the work. I had an amazing supervisor who was a social worker, and I ended up going back to school for a social work degree. And my interest in stigma in particular, which has really shaped my career trajectory, sort of took life from observing the experiences people had with stigma and the impact on their quality of life. And it sort of influenced my teaching and my my research trajectory thus far. And I always tell my students that I've been in this institution at CSSW for the last 17 years, starting out as a student, and I joke that that might happen to them. It's an honor to be able to say that and to be here today with my colleagues to talk about such an important issue.
And thank you, Amy, for joining us here today on Social Impact Live. Jeanette, your introduction?
The oldest goes last, right? So I am thrilled to be here this morning or this afternoon for all of you. And I'm pleased to just share a little bit about myself. So, I did a lot of thinking before this show, and I realized that my background comes out of my interest in social justice. And so as a younger person, it was either law or social work. And obviously I chose social work. Now, I had a realization that I never had before in thinking about this program. And that is that all of my focus since the time I was younger really was shaped by my experience in Hawaii. So in particular, Hawaii is a very political place, political in terms of government political. And so my interests have long been the structures, the mechanisms, and the processes around governance and around policymaking. And additionally, this comes out of my Asian heritage as well, my interest in long-term care and aging. So here I am.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jeanette. I will also share a little bit of my background as well, what brought me to social work, and sort of just keeping the story short. I had actually gotten a PhD in cultural anthropology before coming to the School of Social Work. And I think the reasons why I've sort of been interested in anthropology and social work sort of stem from the same source, which is, sort of growing up as Japanese American in New York at a time when there weren't very many Asians around. I can remember going to public school and basically being the only Asian in the school besides my sister, who was a few years behind me, and always just feeling sort of in between, kind of this hybrid, the Asian and the American, and never really fully feeling fully at home, sort of with either. And sort of negotiating that, and sort of being in a position where I was always trying to sort of reconcile those two aspects, right? Through academic study in anthropology, and I think in social work now, sort of trying to understand how people understand themselves and each other, right? How we relate to one another, and how we can do that in more equitable, better ways. So that's sort of what's informed a lot of my understanding of social work, and hopefully something that I can contribute to today's conversation as we look at the current moment, right? But also understanding that what we're seeing now in terms of anti-Asian hate and hate crimes comes out of a long history, right, of discrimination and oppression of Asian Americans, Asians in not just the United States, but I would say also part of a larger global phenomenon as well. Issue is, what do we do about it? What can we do? What can we learn from the past that can be applied to the current moment, right? As we seek to not only understand the experience of anti-Asian hate, but how to end it. So that's, yes, our charge for today. And I don't know if we want to start with more of a historical background. And again, Jeanette, I saved you for last because I went in alphabetical order, not because I was looking at people's ages or anything, but I know that you've got a particular interest, right, in the history and the history of policy with regard to Asian Americans and their rights, and on the flip side, the discrimination that we've experienced. So, would you like to share some of your thoughts about that history?
Yeah, maybe just a few words. Let me just point out, first of all, that one of the things that's so clear if you look at us is that we are so different. Asian American is this huge rubric, and it includes so many people who are actually so different. The other thing that I realized in thinking about this program is that we really are not understood. I think that most people don't know us. We are invisible and have been for a long time. But that's not to say that we've been overlooked in the country by the policies that have been promulgated. And in particular, what I would point out is that there is a long history of discrimination that is not well known in the country. So if you go back to when Asians first came to the United States, they actually came through Hawaii. And that was in the late 1970s, 1700s. And since then, there have been all kinds of laws that have been passed actually against Asians. And I could go through some of them. You know, we all know about the lynchings that took place. Chinese got lynched in huge numbers in California. They came for work. They came as immigrants who worked on the railroads, built the Transcontinental Railroad. The Japanese came to work in the plantations. And then from Hawaii, went to the mainland and, you know, began to form lives for themselves, but later were incarcerated. And we know that there were particular laws that really addressed the quality of our life, made us feel even more as outsiders than we currently face. So some of these laws are pretty egregious, and they go back, you know, quite a bit. So in years past, there was the Rock Springs Massacre. About 30 Chinese immigrants were killed by white miners. And in 1875, there was a Page Act that was passed by Congress that specifically said that they did not wish forced laborers from Asia and Asian women to come to America because we were undesirable people. Then, of course, many of you know about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then there were the Pacific Coast race riots in 1907. In 1907, which is a very interesting year, there was also a gentleman's agreement with Japan to keep the number of Japanese coming to America down. And so, you know, it was also tied to keeping Indians down. So there was never a door open that said, come to America, you can find a place for yourself. It was more like, the door is shut, do not come. And each of us had varying experiences, depending on our age, depending on our, you know, where we lived, etc. So Richard, you and I, when we think about our experiences, have two very different sets of experiences. Mm-hmm. You experienced life as an Asian on the mainland. I experienced life as an Asian in Hawaii. And by the way, in Hawaii and through much of what we could call Asian America, we didn't consider ourselves Asian Americans. We referred to ourselves as Chinese, Japanese, Indian, or what have you, Korean, Filipino, etc. But it was only in the late 1960s and the early 1970s that we began to realize that we were part of this larger grouping called Asian Americans, largely organized for political reasons. The Blacks had organized, you know, the Latinos were being organized. And so we were told that if we were to be really counted and considered, we had to organize ourselves as Asian Americans. So it's a totally, you know, it's a very interesting, diverse history itself. So let me start with that.
No, wonderful. And you've brought up so many important issues here, the invisibility of the Asian population, and at the same time, and maybe it's related, you know, the rich heterogeneity, right, of the Asian experience. And hopefully I'll ask Amy and Qin to sort of speak about that in just a second. I do want to remind our viewers that we reserve the last 10 minutes or so for Q&A. And if you've got a question, please put them into the chat now. So I can get to them, or we can get to them sooner rather than later in the program. And again, we will be extending our program to 12:45 today, so we definitely have time to get everybody's questions in, I think. So there's a question already that's come in. Do you mind discussing the concept of the model minority? I've heard so much about it, and this has caused an intense relationship between the Asian community and other people of color. So, yeah, I'll turn to Amy or Qin. Would you be interested in addressing this issue of the so-called Asians as the so-called model minority, and maybe from your perspective as well?
Jen, it's okay, I'll start and then please jump in. So this model minority myth, as we've come to know it, has sort of presumed that this large heterogeneous group of Asians have very similar experiences and are pretty much fine. No reason to complain. We're doing well. We're successful. And what it's led to, in all honesty, is basically been a way to disguise the racism that we've experienced, as Dr. Takamura shared with us for many, many years. And the significant force, I think, of this stereotype that we're all doing well, that our issues aren't the same as others who are really struggling, sort of dichotomized the Asian experience in a way that sort of made it less than others. And that impact we see certainly on mental health. We see that impact as relating to the hate that we've experienced and seen most recently as well. And, you know, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it, but I'd let Qin share.
Thank you very much. I fully agree. The model minority myth imposes so much mental health burden to our community, to our young people. So many youth, adolescents, just Asian Americans in general, struggle with having to live up to this man-made myth that doesn't really apply to anyone. At the same time, I think we as professionals, we also struggle. We worry about saying the right thing, behaving in a certain way. We worry about whether we can be our authentic self. And that's such a limitation to anyone, right? To realize one's potential or just to live freely as a human being. So I totally reject that. I also think we need to recognize that it's really a weapon to be used to pit Asian Americans against other people of color, other ethnic minority groups, so that we compare against, again, another myth of the white, of the so-called majority. And that's not healthy, and that's a weapon to be used against all of us.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's enough information out there for us to sort of explode this myth, right? The fact that you know, the rate of poverty among the Asian American population is what, 1 in 4. I think the last time I checked. There are also other you know, things that we can look at in terms of income disparity. Heard the other day that there is the greatest level of income disparity among racial groups is within the Asian community, which I definitely want to look at some more. And yeah, I'm not sure, you know, where the myth of the model minority originated, and obviously we can sort of talk about the purposes that it's been put to. But I think, you know, the second part of the question, you know, that it's created this friction between Asians and other people of color, and so I think is because there are Asians who also subscribe to this myth, right? Who want to talk about how they were able, you know, to pull themselves up, you know, from by the bootstraps. I can't remember the exact phrase, and you know, sort of, again, how that's been interpreted and received by other communities of color, I think is something that also needs to be considered in our conversation. I know that we've got more questions coming in, and I just maybe I can turn to Professor Gao now, and maybe just talk about a little your research and the survey that you've been doing to really sort of flesh out the impact of anti-Asian hate in the current moment, if you don't mind.
Of course, thank you. As part of a research team, I have been doing research on a project called New York City Longitudinal Survey of Well-Being. The purpose is really to capture how New Yorkers are doing, New Yorkers of all racial ethnicities, who live in different boroughs at different income levels. So the project started in 2012, and we've been following 3 previous cohorts. Last year, it was at the beginning of the year, we were ready to launch the 4th cohort of study, and the pandemic hit. So it gave us a perfect opportunity to capture the immediate and long-term impacts of COVID-19. Also, because we see the Asian American community has been growing rapidly, particularly in New York City. So we decided to add a Mandarin-speaking oversample to capture New Yorkers of Chinese descent. We didn't sample other Asian subgroups, not because we didn't want to, because we had limited funding. So we started with this group. I will just share our findings, 3 key findings. First, anti-Asian racism spiked during the pandemic. Our data show about 57% of people of Chinese descent in New York said they experienced at least one type of discrimination in everyday life since the pandemic hit. Among them, excuse me, among them, 20% said they've been harassed or threatened. That's a very significant number. We also asked the respondents why they thought these things happened, and 76% said it's because of their race or skin color, and 64% said it's because where they're from, their country of origin. So that's the first finding. Second finding, racism hurt. 70% of our respondents said they worried about them and their family's safety from a hate crime or harassment. 65% said they tried to avoid certain situations or places because they worried about being targets of racial discrimination. And 61% said they felt uneasy in public places. These are very high levels of stress and vigilance for a person to carry around. We also conducted some qualitative interviews with our participants. One phrase kept coming up, that is on tenterhooks. People said they are constantly having to worry, having to look around to see, to check out the surroundings, to see if somebody might be following them, and they try to avoid going out and then stay home and feel depressed. This is the second finding. The third finding, some people experienced double pandemic. Among our sample, those who had material hardships, such as paying a bill, getting enough food, those who had this kind of hardships were more likely to be targets of racial discrimination and hate crimes. They also had higher levels of stress and vigilance. A lot of people in their qualitative interviews said they're disheartened. They felt terrified by the racial political divisions in our country. Some did also say there's still hope. They're happy and inspired to see American people come together to demand equality and racial justice. So we're going to launch a new wave of survey in May to see what's been happening lately, given what's been happening in our country. But these findings are just wake-up calls for us to hear the voices of Asian Americans, particularly in our study, those in New York, to see what impact, consequences these have on the people we co-reside, co-live, co-survive in our country.
Yeah, thank you, Qin, and I think beyond, sort of bringing out those voices, it's also your research serves as a means of reclaiming that space, right, in a larger conversation in the United States about discrimination and harassment, and I hate to go back to these issues that seem to sort of split, and sort of break down the experience, but it's come up in people's questions, and I'm glad that you acknowledged, that obviously we can use the Chinese community as a sort of sample case, right? But we need to do more in terms of looking at what's happening with other populations, East Asian, South Asian, and so on. And also, you've looked at the differences. The third finding about material hardship, right? And maybe how race is complicated by issues of class in the United States as well, and looking at people's socioeconomic status within and differences within the Asian population, because that brings me back to maybe sort of the complicated response that we all had to the Atlanta shootings, and sort of again different experiences of different people who identify as Asian, and also adding a layer of gender to that as well. So there's just so much that's overlaid and intersecting in this experience. And I'm just wondering, how do we come together? Right? There's the question there. It's such a heterogeneous and diverse group. How can we more effectively unify in some sort of quote pan-Asian kind of community? Any thoughts about that?
Richard, I do have a few thoughts about that one. So let me just start by saying that the Asian American community has not experienced the depth and length in terms of years of experience of the level of egregious oppression that our Black brothers and sisters have. So just straight out, I think we need to acknowledge that. We came to America later. So of course our experiences are a bit shorter. But I would also like to make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that we are probably one of the groups that is most defined through social construction. We never saw ourselves as Asian Americans. We have experiences that were actually created by the conversations in society that oftentimes did not include us. The model minority label, for example. That's not something we participated in. It's something that was kind of put on us by the conversations in the larger society. So I do feel that, our identity and the answers that can be brought to bear to some degree come from the voices within the Asian American community that can begin to take hold of how we identify ourselves and who we say we are in this context, because we are so different and we have some similar experiences. So I think the social construction of who we are has until now been largely defined by others.
Yeah, and as well as just the experience of discrimination and oppression. And I think there is a comment and from the audience, if we talk about the model minority myth but do not point to its anti-Black origins, or honestly any matter of talking about anti-Asian sentiments without speaking to anti-Blackness, that is a huge miss. And I think that's a point that you were now bringing up, Jeanette. The hashtag Stop Asian Hate is a problematic hashtag that has resulted in a coalition built on API folks feeling like they can and should rely on carceral means of accountability and justification for increased funding for police and state violence. And that's the COVID-19 hate crimes bill that's currently up before Congress, right? And just to, again, sort of trying to understand this in larger terms, right? Stop Asian Hate. Are we unintentionally, right, sort of promoting or abetting, sort of racist policies that have targeted Black people in our country? Thinking about a crimes bill and just framing it in terms of crimes. How do we flip the narrative and really turn it into something that, again, bridges Stop Asian Hate with Black Lives Matter? I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the power of simply saying the names of people who've been victims of violence in different settings, including at the hands of the police, and the George Floyds and the Dante Wrights and so on, who need to be acknowledged. And then I was thinking about the victims of the Atlanta shootings, and different people are represented, but it's people don't hear the names of Asians. I mean, the difficulty even just saying them, right? Let alone remembering them. And I'm just, how do we, I don't want to appropriate, right? Terms or anything else from the Black Lives Matter movement, but how can we learn, from the experience of others and do this in a way that doesn't hurt what we're all trying to achieve for ourselves, right? Better lives and fairer, more equitable treatment at the hands of everyone else. I don't know. I know I'm sort of turning it into a larger discussion here, and so on. So how do we sort of turn away from the marginalization, I guess, that we've felt as Asian Americans, and speak our truth, reclaim our space without taking away from others, right? Without pushing people to the side of this dialogue. I mean, I think it does go back to maybe some of what you've been looking at, Amy, and just issues of stigma and marginalization, and what the path is to sort of foster that more positive conversation. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. No, I've been sitting here thinking about how to grapple with and I think we've been all thinking about this, how to grapple with polarization that's been happening in our larger country, certainly at the School of Social Work as well. And these are the complexities that can draw conclusions that can be dangerous, or assumptions that can be dangerous as well. And I think I think it's important to recognize this concept of othering, in the way in which othering by dominant groups increases the risks of racism and discrimination and daily harassment and microaggressions across the spectrum of people who are marginalized and experience marginalization. And that's something really important to remember. Going back to the comment about, not mentioning the importance of recognizing where the minority myth comes from, being rooted in anti-Black racism. I don't know that it's forgotten. I don't think it can be forgotten. I think that myth has such deep roots within the Asian communities in the United States and across the globe, in fact, and that myth in and of itself needs to be sort of rewritten, right? That narrative needs to be challenged, and where it's hard because there's such a massive heterogeneity among this group that's been created for us, right? Where on the spectrum of anti-Blackness do Asians fit, is something really important to think about, and to move away from comparisons, to move toward this collective notion of what's really important. And what really is important in my sort of understanding is this notion of social justice, right? The recognition that the impact of structural racism and stigma and discrimination is so impactful on mental health outcomes of all marginalized communities. We've heard today some examples about intersectionality with class, with sexism, right? all of these intersectional components also matter tremendously, right? And have equally impactful effects on mental illness or mental health challenges and toxic stress and chronic stress and the wear and tear on our physiological and psychological selves, right? So I think these are not simple concepts and questions to grapple with, and I wish we had tons more time to dive into these things. I think really coming together and recognizing where the collective pieces lie, where while histories might be very different, where are the connections that we can work where we can work from to enhance social justice and equity becomes really important.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. I appreciate your ability to sort of kind of set the stage, right? Lay the foundation for us to sort of create those connections and to broaden the conversation. I think, coming into the program today, I sort of felt like just having the three of you together and for us to sort of create a space, for us to maybe process what the experience of the last year has been like for us on a personal level is an important first step, right? Before we're able, I think, then to sort of go out and do that necessary work of joining and hopefully building a larger coalition. And I think it seems to be happening, right? In this time, that the seeds are there, at least within sort of broader American popular opinion. I'd like to shift slightly, if we have a few minutes, just because the question came up in the chat, but sort of looking at this internationally, right? It's not just an internal issue. I mean, it has to do with China and how the United States feels about China as a superpower, right? Economically, militarily, and the sense of threat and how people are responding to that. So I was wondering, Jin, if there was anything about that you wanted to add to our conversation?
Of course, in our research, we see racism interacts and is layered with xenophobia so much. Our respondents said, when asked why discrimination happened to them, they would say, because I worked in the healthcare sector, because I was wearing a mask, because I was not wearing a mask. I mean, these are innocent, but they are all connected to the virus at the beginning being called the China virus, being attributed to a certain population. So those hurt people terribly. And in our conversations with other scholars, many scholars, historians record to me when Japan was on the rise. Also in the US, there was anti-Japan, anti-Asian sentiment, which translated to discrimination and hate crimes and harassment to people from Japan, but also from Asia broadly. And this history, unfortunately, is repeating. So I fully agree we should work together with the Black Lives Matter movement. I recently joined a rally of Blacks and Asians together, standing against racism. But I think we should also be aware of xenophobia and how these international relations are affecting how we view and treat people, our neighbors who are part of our community. And if people cannot see that, that's going to hurt not only a pocket of population, but also the larger society as well.
Thank you, Jin, for that. I think recommendation, I'll frame it that way, right? That we all participate in, good and necessary protest to, again, reclaim our space and make that a group enterprise as much as possible. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I just thought we could conclude with any other action steps, any things that you would encourage our viewers to do, right, to stop Asian hate that you think, and you could be speaking to Asians, Asian Americans, non-Asians, and so what would your suggestions be as a takeaway from this program? And Jeanette, I don't know if
Yeah,
you
well, I
have
think some of what we need to say has been said by Qin and Amy. So, absolutely, we have to be politically and otherwise active. No question about that. I have a little prediction here, and that is that this sort of sentiment against people of color, and I don't mean just Asians, I mean against Blacks and Latinos and others, I expect will rise in the decades ahead unless we really are working concertedly to fight against that. And the reason I say that is, China is on the ascent, no question about it. But within the United States, the year 2043 is just a year that, sets off alarm bells for the white supremacists, when in fact we expect to see the population within the United States be majority minority. So I think as we move towards that year 2043, we're not going to see a diminishing of these feelings of hate against people who are different. I predict it'll begin to rise.
All right. Thank you, Jeanette. Turn to you, Amy. Any thoughts about or recommendations?
So I think a few things, sort of thinking about the interpersonal things that we can do. First and foremost is believe people. Don't ask for explanations or question experiences. I would want to encourage people to share stories. I know there are lots of movements in social media to share stories of hate and discrimination. Being careful of wording, even the term anti-Asian sentiment can sort of be warm and fuzzy, but it's truly hate, right? Not just with Asians, of course, but across marginalized populations. Having that ongoing self-awareness of our own biases and our own privileged statuses that come and go throughout the day even, right? And I think building community, which we've talked about today as well, within and across marginalized groups, are just some sort of strategies I think that can be helpful. And of course, being very mindful of taking care of our mental health challenges and experiences that people have as they face daily discrimination and racism.
All right. Thank you, Amy. And Dr. Gao, do you have any final comments to add?
Thank you so much, Richard. Just to add to what Jeanette and Amy have already said, I fully agree with everything they said. I would say let's all be braver. I know we all have to be vulnerable and expose our pain and sufferings, and but I think we need to be braver for ourselves, because sometimes if we carry the weight with us, it actually damages us. For our children who need to know the truth, and for the broader community who need to see us and hear our voices, I think only when that happens, we can come together to address the issues of racism and xenophobia, and to work together to make this society a better place. Thank you.
Qin, I know you've said a lot about this topic, and you've done the research, and I think you've also provided us some resources, and Amy as well, that we can post, I think, on Facebook and also YouTube as an accompaniment to this program for people who are interested in looking into organizations and services related to stopping Asian hate, and also for people who are experiencing that hate, how to manage that, how to promote your own emotional resilience in the face of this harassment, of victimization I think that one of the resources that I shared and I think is helpful is called a bystander intervention training. The organization is called Hollaback, Hollaback. It's kind of odd because often when I experience discrimination and harassment, I often feel like a bystander to it in a strange way. I'm shocked, and I don't even, sort of accept that it's happening to me, right? That I'm being told on the train that I don't belong here, and I'm puzzled. I'm like, what do you mean? This is the train I take to work every day. What do you? Oh, I see. Yeah, you're looking at me, and I don't belong in this country, and so how can people, non-Asian or in any situation, respond? And Hollaback has this wonderful training. They talk about these 5 Ds: to distract, delegate, document, delay, and at the very last, directly address these kinds of situations, always sort of keeping in mind foremost your own safety, right, in responding and dealing with these acts of hate. So so that would be my recommendation for people to look into as a follow-up. So I think that brings us to the end of our time here. I think we could go on for much longer, but we do have to say goodbye now. So Professor Qin Gao, Professor Amy Kapadia, and Dean Jeanette Takamura, thank you so much for being on Social Impact Live today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And since this is our last program of the year, I would like to thank all of our guests who've appeared on Social Impact Live from September for so generously sharing their time with us and with the broader Columbia School of Social Work community. I'd also like to thank our wonderful team here, without whom this program would not run so smoothly and well from week to week. And that includes John Bone, Katrine Kalkatanidis, David Licata, and Janet Young. So I'd like to give them a shout out, including our Director of Communications at the School of Social Work, Mary Leah Cox, without whom and whose vision this program would not exist. But lastly, and most importantly, I'd like to thank all of our viewers and all of you who are out there every day helping to make an impact on this world and doing the work that we as social workers strive to do. So thank you all. Good luck. Take care. Hope to see you again in the fall. Bye-bye for now.